Hi, and welcome to this video all about how to enable your SharePoint sites for external sharing. So there's a couple of steps to the process of enabling a site for external access. So the first thing we need to do is enable the overarching policy in the SharePoint Admin Center to allow us to actually share content externally. But that's not actually setting the kind of default for SharePoint sites, because actually it's usually only a handful of sites that you ever want to enable external sharing for. Often, majority, 99% of the SharePoint sites will be internal use only. So the first thing we need to do is enable that policy within the SharePoint Admin Center. Now, to get to the Admin Center, we go to office.com, which is the homepage of Microsoft 365, and then we can go to the Admin Center by clicking on this button. Now, you'll only see this button appear if you are either a global administrator of your Microsoft 365 tenant or you have the SharePoint admin role. So I have that role, so I'm going to click on the admin, which is going to take me to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And then when you click on Show All, you can then see we have this SharePoint option to go to the SharePoint Admin Center. By clicking on that, we're going to then navigate us to the SharePoint Admin Center. And when the options appear on the left-hand side, you will be able to see we've got this drop-down called Policies. So I'm going to select that, and then I'm going to click on Sharing, as it's the sharing policy that we're interested in today. Now, you may not already be aware, but OneDrive is essentially under the umbrella of SharePoint. So there's no OneDrive Admin Center. So any of the kind of configurations that you're making for external sharing policies for SharePoint can also be made with OneDrive alongside it. Now, there's 4 options when it comes to external sharing policies for both SharePoint and OneDrive, and they're adjusted using this slider. So using this slider will adjust them, and you can see we can actually have different policy levels for OneDrive and SharePoint by using these sliders to move them to different categories. Now, the 4 categories of external sharing that we have is, starting at the very top, the most lenient option is known as the anyone level. Now, this literally means users can share files and folders using links that don't require sign-in. So this is also sometimes referred to as anonymous sharing links. So it means that we can grab a link to a SharePoint site, to a file, a folder, and share that out externally to people without actually having to need them to sign in at all. Now, this doesn't mean that content is readily available via a Google search, for example, or anyone can join. It does have to be shared to them, but they don't have to be signed in or registered in any way for them to actually access your SharePoint content. The next level down is new and existing guests, which means guests must sign in or provide a verification code. Now, existing guests can be set up back inside of our Office 365 or Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Under Users, you've got this Guest Users area. And this is where you can come in and add a new guest user, which is essentially a record inside of your Azure Active Directory, where you can specify that somebody is an external user, and it will put them inside of this kind of pot inside of your Active Directory, and it will have the ability to name them, have their first name, last name, and details about them that's stored alongside that record, which just basically means when they come and log into your SharePoint content, your Active Directory, as in your Microsoft 365, is aware of who they are and that they are actually a guest that the system is expecting to join. We can also say existing guests, which means that we can't create any new guests, but existing guests which already exist inside your organization's Active Directory can be shared to externally. Or we can say only people in your organization, which is the strictest option available when it comes to external sharing, because it basically doesn't allow it. It just does not allow external sharing. Now, just to reiterate, when we're setting these policies, this is the maximum that we're allowing it to be shared to. It doesn't mean that this is the default. This means that this is the maximum that we're allowing to be possibly shared. So in this aspect, I'm actually going to say anyone can access SharePoint and OneDrive using anonymous accessing sharing. Sometimes you see that actually that option is only given to OneDrive, especially when people are first using Microsoft 365 and they're new to SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams. Often it's OneDrive that gets opened up for anonymous access sharing, as in this anyone link first, because you're mitigating the risk, because it's much less likely that something sensitive is going to be shared out from a OneDrive, or if it was, it's mitigating and sort of siloing it a little bit more than opening up a full SharePoint site for potential anyone to be able to access. So I've selected this, and now I've got a couple of options beneath here as well. So you've got a couple of options such as choosing the type of link that's selected by default when users share files and folders in SharePoint and OneDrive. So this really comes down to how you want people to be able to use the site, and what is the chances that they're going to be clicking that share button and sharing it with only people in your organization, or are they more likely to be sharing it to anyone, as in external people outside of the organization? We could also say specific people. Now, quite often, 9 times out of 10, most people, when they're sharing documents, even if it's sharing on a site which is for external use, they would have the only people in the organization. You can also configure this option at a site level as well, is worth mentioning. This is just the default setting which will apply to all sites. We can also choose the permissions that are selected by default for sharing links. So we can say that, say for example, 9 times out of 10, most people would only be viewing things rather than editing. We can set that to be the default option when we're coming to share out a link. Again, when we're choosing that share button, and we can choose whether it's a view only link or an edit link, this is just setting the default for what that option will be when we click on that share button. We can always change it at the time we're clicking on share. We can also set the default expiration as well. So it might be that this link only lasts for 30 days and then it'll kill the link after that 30 days and the link will no longer work. So these are the basic things that we need to be aware of. Once we're happy with that, we click on the Save button, and that will then apply this sharing policy to our SharePoint site, or sites, should I say. Next, this is the overarching policy. Now we need to actually apply the external sharing to a specific site. So if I go to active sites, I can see all the different sites that I've got available to me. Now, let's just have a little look at this from, I'm not going to create a new site. I'm just going to apply this directly to a site that already exists. Let's say, for example, my crisis management site. I might want to share content with people externally for them to be able to see what we do under a crisis. So I'm going to select on that site, and then on the top up here, you can see we've got this sharing option. I'm going to click on sharing, and it's going to show me, by default, it's set to only people in your organization have access to this content or can be shared this content. Now, because I've enabled a policy which allows me to go as far as sharing this with anyone in the world, that's why I see all 4 options. If I had set my policy to be something that was more restricted, say, for example, only sharing with new and existing guests or existing guests only, then the other options which are not available would be grayed out to me at this point. Because I can actually share this out, I'm going to click on anyone, and then this is basically going to allow me to share this with anyone outside of my organization. I can also choose some other options, so I can choose things like the expiration date. So I can choose actually have a specific expiry date for this site specific, and same goes with the sharing link type. So when I was looking at before, the default would be only people in your organization, but I could choose specifically for this site for it to be anyone with a link. There's a couple of other options there. Take a little look at them, play with them in your own time, and then once you're happy, click on save, and that will then save the external sharing options for that site. So now when I click on this, it'll open up my site. Then once my site is appeared, you'll see that there's a share option across the top. So if I just wanted to share the whole site, I wanted an external party to be able to access the whole site, the home page and the documents contained within it, I can then click on this share option, and then when the box appears, this is where I can choose to then type in an email address. I'm just going to pick a fake email address, so dougie@fake.com. Now this knows that this is an email address which is outside of my organization, so it's going to give me that prompt message say this email address is outside of your organization. So if I wasn't aware, I know that I'm sharing it outside the organization. Now if I had entered a email address which was outside of my organization, but the policy was restricted, or the site was restricted not to allow external sharing, then it would just come up and say, sorry, this site does not allow for external sharing, or this is not a guest of the Microsoft 365, so it's not going to allow me. It wouldn't give me that sharing option. But because I do have that, I have the ability then to say, well, what permission do I want to give them? Now, I'm not going to explain the full ins and outs of these different permissions. There's a separate video which previously explains those different permissions, so go check that out if you're interested. So I'm just going to say read only, so I just want them to read access to the site. I can give a custom message, so I can say, please look at this site, and then click on share, and that'll then send them a email from Microsoft with that details, with the thumbnail of my site and that custom message, and they'll be able to click on that to open up the site. So that's sharing the whole SharePoint site with an external user. But what if it was just a particular file or folder that I wanted to share externally? This is where I can click on Documents, and then I can open up the documents on this site. Now, when I select a document and I click on that Share option, you can see here I've got a couple of different options here. I can choose to share a link, or I can even copy a link. Now, share a link will then pop out this box like this, which gives me a full options about sending out an automated email, essentially. Or if I choose copy link, it will just basically give me the link, allowing me to share this just by copying the link, and it will have people with this link can view, basically automatically set. But I'm just going to go into clicking share a link, which is basically going to generate an automated email. Again, I can choose what options I want to select. Now, at the moment, it's saying people with this link, essentially, inside this organization can share it, or I can say anyone with this link. Now, it depends on what that default setting was that we looked at earlier, depends on which one of these options will be set by default. Same goes as well with the ability to edit the documents or not, or if it's set to view. Currently it's set to view as a default, but I could make the default back in that admin center back to edit, and this box would automatically be edit. But essentially we're selecting who should have access, so I can say anyone with a link, they can edit it. I could set an expiration date if I wanted to using this picker box. I could set a password if I wanted using this picker box. And if I selected that this is a view only option, I can also choose to block the download, which basically means then I can share this with anyone. They can open up the document, they can read it, but they cannot edit it, they cannot delete it, and they can't basically make any amendments to that document. Once I click on apply, I can then choose who I want to send the email to. So I could choose that dougie@fake.com again, and then send an email to there. Again, it knows it's outside the organization with a custom message. Please take a look at this document. Then I can click on send, and that will then automatically send that email with a link directly just to that one document. So we've looked at a couple of different options there. We've looked at sharing the full site with somebody, and we've looked at sharing individual documents. Just as a recapper, we've gone into the SharePoint Admin Center. We've set up the external sharing policy. We've then gone into the SharePoint Admin Center, again under Sites, and we've then applied that policy to a particular site to allow it to then become an extranet, where we're then sharing content. We then looked at the ability to share the whole site with everybody, and we looked at the ability to share individual individual documents with people. So I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for future Microsoft and SharePoint training tips.